Hi, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with a special issue update on the Bruce Ohr FBI documents detailing the coup cabal targeting President Trump, plus a special discussion on the death of Jeffrey Epstein and what Judicial Watch is doing to try to find the truth of the matter. Thanks for joining us, and thank you. We're here with Bill Marshall, who's one of our senior investigators here at Judicial Watch. Bill, a lot's been going on in the past few weeks here at Judicial Watch, and I want to talk about these Bruce Ohr documents because there are major revelations in them. But the big news this week also is the strange death of Jeffrey Epstein. He was being prosecuted by the Southern District of New York, the Department of Justice. He was held in a federal facility in Manhattan, and he died. And obviously everyone is up in arms over this, and people want to know whether he was killed, whether he committed suicide, as the initial reports suggest. Give us a feeling for why people ought to be concerned about this issue.
Well, Jeffrey Epstein obviously was a prominent figure with a lot of dirt on a lot of people, primarily Democrats, I would note. As we know, George Mitchell, now former Senate Majority Leader, has been implicated in the Epstein's activities, shall we say, with underage girls. Other individuals, include, of course, former President Bill Clinton, former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson. In fact, that was litigation, private litigation it was a defamation lawsuit, I believe, brought by Virginia Giuffre, formerly Virginia Roberts, who was one of the girls who was trafficked, who was, I believe, considered a sex slave of Jeffrey Epstein.
So he was prosecuted initially several years ago. Mm-hmm. He had an agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Florida that all crimes he had committed were taken care of as a result of a state plea deal. And there's been a lot of controversy about that deal, whether he got a slap on the wrist. So the Justice Department is prosecuting him again, or was prosecuting him again until he died, up in the Southern District of New York. And he was arrested, denied bail. About 4 or 6 weeks ago, he's found lying on the floor. He'd either been attacked or potentially suicide attempt. Give us some background as to what the state of it, what was going on just before he died.
Right. The reports that came out relating to that, I believe, was July 23rd incident in which he is found in the fetal position of his cell in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. Were kind of sketchy. There was not a whole lot of detail as to exactly how these injuries. I believe they claimed there were ligature marks on his neck, which would be indicative of strangling or hanging, a sort of injury.
Well, there's a big difference. Either you're being hanged, or you're going to hang yourself, or someone's trying to choke you to death. Which one was it?
Well, that's one of the questions. It was never clear as to whether these were self-inflicted injuries or inflicted by someone else. He was then put on suicide watch, which would imply that he tried to hang himself on July 23rd. So he's put on suicide watch. He's on suicide watch, I believe, for something like 6 days. Right? Then he's taken off suicide watch, which I find that bizarre, to say the least, considering the amount of information that this individual had about very powerful figures. I would think you'd want eyes on him 24/7, regardless of whether he was on suicide watch. I was shocked to learn that there were not cameras pointed into his cell, apparently, but just in the exterior, in the corridor outside of his cell. Well, that's one of the things that we're asking for from the Bureau of Prisons. We're asking for, in a request I submitted recently, we're asking for all audio-video recordings of Jeffrey Epstein. We're asking for all psychological evaluations. We want the roster of guards that were purportedly guarding him. We've asked for all communications about him among BOP officials. So a whole
why are we doing this, Bill? Isn't the Justice Department investigating itself?
Well, I think given the track record of the Justice Department in the last few years, looking at what they did, what they attempted to perpetrate, which I guess will be part of our next discussion, in terms of the attempted coup against. Well, first the attempted derail the Republican presidential candidate through a fraudulently predicated
and a protection racket for Hillary Clinton.
Oh yeah. Oh, well, one can't forget. We only have so much time, of course, right now to discuss all these things.
We have all the time in the world.
Well, we have all the time in the world to go after these records. That's for sure, and that's something we've been doing and we'll continue to do.
So to be clear, there are these questions about the circumstances of his death. We still don't know whether it's suicide or homicide. At least the medical examiner hasn't released his autopsy report. And no matter what the answers are officially, because of the lack of credibility and the controversy of his death, there are going to be few Americans who are going to buy into it or be satisfied with the answers. So we're not going to rely on the Justice Department to do it. Judicial Watch is doing its own investigation through the Freedom of Information Act. So we have several requests. We have our investigative reporter, Chief Investigative Reporter Micah Borson, is based in New York. He's doing his own independent journalism on this. He had an interesting piece where he asked questions, was it suicide or homicide? And a series of questions. And I thought one of the more interesting questions that our colleague Micah had was the scene where he was picked up, was that treated as a crime scene? Well, a brilliant insight. Obviously, one of his sources is, not that Mike is not a smart guy, but this sounds to me like a sensible law enforcement question to be asked. And I don't know if that's the case. I wonder if it was treated as a crime scene, was evidence preserved?
Whenever my understanding is that whenever a suicide occurs in custodial settings, that there is a suicide reconstruction performed along with diagrams and everything else to ascertain exactly how the individual took his own life. From what I understand, it's a fairly rare occurrence when someone is on suicide watch for a successful suicide to take place. Now we know, of course,
well, of course, he wasn't on suicide watch.
Well, that's true too. But what you have to remember now, even if you're not on suicide watch, they're supposed to be checking the cell every 30 minutes. But there's a 3-hour gap, right?
Reportedly,
during which time Epstein apparently committed suicide. Now I've heard just recently, I haven't had a chance to read the reports myself, but I've heard snippets that there was a substitute guard on duty that night.
My guess is the simplest explanation is that there was some corruption in the facility that he helped engineer, or someone helped him engineer, to allow him to commit suicide. But that's the most charitable interpretation of it.
Right.
But because he knew so many people, there were all going to be these questions about who's implicated and who had a motive in wanting to see him pass away.
Right.
We got the Freedom of Information Act requests. We've got, I guess we'll be asking the FBI for records on him. But in my view, Bill, I want your response to this, is the Justice Department is responsible for this man's death. He was in their custody. The Justice Department runs the Bureau of Prisons. And to me, it's just a question of what the details are, what the culpability is, and the level of malfeasance or negligence or whatever. There's no question the Justice Department's responsible for it. And as I talk about that, how can a Justice Department investigate itself? Is there another way to get an official investigation of this because of the complicated, conflicted issues of the Justice Department's involvement?
I don't think there is. Now Attorney General Barr, as you know, gave a very strong statement in which he said that there were 2 investigations ongoing. One, I believe, by the FBI that he had ordered, and one by the Inspector General of DOJ, I believe was the second one. Heads are going to have to roll in this thing. Everyone, in my mind, everyone from the guards who are on duty to the head of the Bureau of Prisons should probably go, and everyone in between. This is, as you allude to, this was such an egregious failure. When you look at somebody with the information that Epstein had, and the obvious necessity to keep him alive and monitored constantly, that it just beggars the question. how could such a lapse occur? And it's going to raise, especially given the FBI DOJ history that we've discussed with, regarding Hillary's email server and the fraudulently predicated counterintelligence investigation against candidate Trump, and then the attempt to essentially remove him from office, is just so outside the bounds of anything we would ever have conceived of happening in our government, that it naturally raises questions in everyone's mind. I mean, it's on the DOJ.
Well, Bill, look, Bill, without getting into details about your background, you have significant experience investigating issues like this. I mean, this isn't your first go-around in investigating an unusual death. I mean, you've looked at records where you've examined autopsy reports, you've done investigations tied to unusual deaths. I mean, what's ringing in your head when you look at the facts around the facts as we know?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, I also have federal law enforcement experience from the DEA, and then I spent many years investigating deaths for insurance companies, actually, oddly enough. And every manner of death that you can imagine: homicides, suicides, natural deaths, accidental deaths, faked deaths.
So what's your instinct on this? Do a little.
I can't conceive of a situation in which you have a cell with nothing, no protuberances, from which someone, in theory, could tie anything. You have 8 or 9 foot high ceilings, so it's not like you can attach something to the ceiling. Judith Miller, I believe, who actually, as you recall, the former New York Times reporter who had to go to prison, has written an op-ed in which she said, who's been in these facilities herself when she was serving time in prison for I believe, was it alleged leak?
She refused to divulge sources, so they tried to get her to do that by putting her in jail.
Exactly. So she's speaking from firsthand experience within those facilities, saying it was, in her view, it was not possible.
So the New York Post is reporting he hung himself by tying himself to the bed frame and then dropping down.
Using a sheet, yeah. Now, I believe, I understand it takes about 7 pounds of pressure on the neck to cause asphyxiation. Eventually, if you're leaning forward, you pass out, and then you asphyxiate yourself.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. The medical examiner, they had Michael Baden, who was requested to observe, I believe, by
his lawyers.
Yes.
By Epstein's lawyers.
Right.
So the medical examiner is conducting the autopsy for the New York, and there's an outside expert who is observing on behalf of the Epstein.
Right, and now the medical examiner has apparently asked for additional information, which is not unusual because typically a medical examiner has to rule on cause and manner of death. Manner of death is something that is suicide, homicide, natural causes. Sort of the manner of death. The cause of death is the actual approximate cause of asphyxiation or whatever it might be, if cerebral hemorrhage, whatever the exact physical cause is, as opposed to manner, which is more the category of death. So it's generally up to the medical, under the law, it's up to the medical examiner to determine the cause and manner of death. It's not up to investigating police officers or prosecutors or anybody like that. It's actually up to the medical examiner to make that determination.
But as you know, based on your experience, there's going to be a lot of second guessing.
I can sure. I have a lot of questions, and like I say,
of the report, assuming he has a conclusion, he will have a conclusion, and there's going to be controversy about that. This is why the corruption at the Justice Department needs to be dealt with in a forthwith manner, because you've got the most famous prisoner in America who has information potentially about all sorts of other famous people dying in custody. Mm-hmm. And no one trusts the Justice Department because of its misconduct under Barack Obama, and the FBI as well. And we're expecting these folks to have any credibility when they tell us, well, this is what happened.
Exactly. The damage.
I say, thank God for Judicial Watch, who can bring some level of trust to this controversy.
I don't know, honestly, and I say this as disinterestedly as I can, as a longtime employee of Judicial Watch. I don't know of any other institutions within Washington, within the United States, that are doing comparable work. Certainly not on the Freedom of Information Act front. There are good investigative, conservative journalists out there who are looking hard at the deep state and the corruption, and you know them better than I do, and who are doing good work. And I don't mean to in any way slight their efforts, but I think that in terms of litigating FOIA and getting records out of the government, and that's sort of the soft underbelly, if you will, of the government, is the fact that it's meticulous at record keeping, and thankfully, really thank God, the Congress had the foresight to, and I believe in 1964, enact the Freedom of Information Law, which gives us these invaluable records. I don't know where we would be, frankly, as a society without that ability.
Well, that's a good segue, because the reason for doing this special issue update was to talk about a big find we had as a result of a Freedom of Information Act request and lawsuit, which were for specific Bruce Ohr FBI interview reports that Congress had wanted, that I guess were seen as keys to the kingdom in exposing the Spygate targeting of President Trump. And Judicial Watch sued for them in court last year, and they were previously marked secret. They were withheld in their entirety. Someone at the Justice Department, I would presume the Attorney General under the authorities granted to him by the President, now this is a big presumption, decided they need to be released. And they gave them to Judicial Watch thanks to frankly, to the pressure of our lawsuit. And what did they show?
Well, they show...
Why did they hide them for so long?
Well, one thing they certainly demonstrate is this, as Greg Jarrett wrote an excellent piece looking at our records himself, and as a lawyer, as a legal analyst for Fox News, and he described this, and I can particularly appreciate this because I used to be a money laundering specialist for the Drug Enforcement Administration.
You weren't a money launderer. You were
That's right. I was an intelligence analyst looking at the money launderers, just to be clear. Yeah, but he used the metaphor, the analogy. It was an information laundering operation. That is what these 302s demonstrated more than anything, was that you had Christopher Steele, a foreign agent, a paid operative of Hillary Clinton, feeding information to Bruce Ohr, who was feeding it in turn to Special Agent Joe Pientka of the FBI, who was feeding it to his partner, Peter Strzok, who was feeding it to Andrew McCabe, the Deputy Director of the FBI, who was feeding it to James Comey. This is an information washing.
So Bruce Ohr was a senior official at the Justice Department.
Right.
He knows Glenn Simpson. He knows Christopher Steele. His wife, Nellie Ohr, has also been hired by Fusion GPS that was running the Clinton spy ring for her during the campaign targeting Trump. We know that through our other document request, our FOIA request, that Christopher Steele, this foreign spy you talked about, had been paid by the FBI. 11 of the 13 times he met with him in 2016. Then they fired him because he was a leaker. So they start talking, using Ohr as a vehicle for getting, as you point out, laundering this information into the FBI and Justice Department. And these communications with Ohr and this desperation to get Steele's info is beginning not before the campaign, but after the president's elected.
Yep.
So these are FBI 302 reports all about targeting the president. And the first report we uncover details Steele's bias against President Trump. I don't have the wording in front of me, I don't know if you do, but he was desperate and passionate about keeping the president out of office.
Right.
But that was no pause. That gave them no pause in using his material, did they?
No.
The other thing I thought was interesting in the reports, and I know we've just talked about the State Department connections here, is that it details that the FBI and DOJ weren't the only recipients of this information. It looks to me like they were flooding the zone. Where can we get this information targeting Trump, and how do we maximize it? Well, let's go to the DOJ, FBI, and where else did they go?
Right, State Department. One of the things these 302s really emphasize too, in my mind, is the centrality, and I don't think this is fully appreciated yet, but the centrality of Bruce Ohr, who was the Associate Deputy Attorney General. I want to get his title right. He was dual-hatted, though, which is very unusual. He held two very senior positions. He was also the head of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, as well as being the Associate Deputy Attorney General. Two big jobs. Now, why on earth? I've always wondered, why on earth would you give an individual like that two top positions? It's tough to do one of those jobs properly, but to do two of them. And what I think these records show more than anything is that he was central. He was feeding, remember, this information. He introduced a top State Department official to Chris Steele in October 2016, Kathleen Kavalek. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Eurasian Affairs, European Affairs.
Who reported to Victoria Nuland, who was the top official.
Exactly. And you'll recall from other records we got, that Kathleen Kavalek said that she found some of his information that he was supplying, Christopher Steele was providing to her, inaccurate.
Yeah, but it didn't stop her.
No, but she forwarded, I will say, she forwarded her report on to the FBI saying that he was providing information that was inaccurate. Specifically, in one instance in particular, Steele claimed that the Russian government was running an intelligence operation, to influence the 2016 election out of the Russian consulate in Miami. She said there is no Russian consulate in Miami. So right there, she shot down this guy's credibility. And yet, 8 days later, the FBI submits a FISA warrant application to the FISA court attesting to the accuracy of all this information that's in this Steele dossier, including that. So, this is so Bruce Ohr was feeding information, to various conduits. He was central to this operation.
And he's being interviewed repeatedly by the FBI to get information from a source or sources that were compromised, according to the FBI, because they were cut off. And he was also they knew, the FBI, because he told them, my wife is working for Fusion GPS, and she's got dirt on Trump. Do you want it? And then what happened? They transfer the information.
He gives them a thumb drive with all of Nellie Ohr's research. A little background on Nellie, and I would commend to everyone an excellent article that our friend Diana West wrote in February 2018 at the American Spectator called Nellie Ohr, Woman in the Middle. And Diana does meticulous research into people's backgrounds. She's read Nellie's books, her reviews of other academics. Nellie, just a little background. Nellie was a Russian linguist, fluent in Russian. She had an undergraduate degree from Harvard. She had a PhD in Russian history from Stanford, as I recall, which she received in 1990. She studied in the Soviet Union during the Cold War in the Soviet Union, 1989. The only way that Nellie Ohr would have been allowed to have done that is if the Soviet Union, the Soviet government, approved of her research. In other words, that it was favorable to the Soviet Union. As Diana,
she was seen as reliable.
Yes, as Diana points out in this article, she was in the revisionist school. Nellie Ohr was in the revisionist school of American academics on Russian history. Her job was to whitewash the atrocities of the Soviet Union. And she is a Stalin apologist in her writings. She called Stalin's murder of over 6 million people and the collectivization of the farms in the Soviet Union excesses. Okay, this is basically make an omelet, and I'm paraphrasing.
So like a lot of leftist intellectual Sovietologists, she was an apologist for the communists.
Yes, and that was deliberate. That was a deliberate effort to counter the Whittaker Chambers of the world, who were the people that were calling out the real atrocities of the Soviet Union. Of course, Whittaker Chambers preceded her by a number of years, but the anti-communism movement of the 1970s and 80s.
And the historic, the beginnings of the real history coming out.
Right.
They needed a counter. So Nellie Ohr is getting this. She's working for Fusion GPS. Ohr tells them she knows she was working for Clinton. Here's a thumb drive of all of her material from Fusion GPS. But what was well, first of all, the whole situation's wildly irregular. But then they're conveying information that's modified to eliminate Fusion GPS from the headers of Nellie's work. Why would they hide? Why would they want to hide it?
That baffles.
Is there any good reason?
That baffles me because they give Bruce Ohr turns over to the FBI Nellie's reports on a thumb drive, but with the Fusion GPS headers stripped out of the reports. Now you're right. Why would they do that? It wasn't like the FBI didn't know they were getting the reports from Fusion GPS, that this was work product. of Nellie Orr, who was working for Fusion GPS. Just as a practical matter, I'm not really clear on
Well, it
how
was
that helps
it was a sorry cover up is what it is. I mean, how else do you conclude it? Why would you?
Right. I mean, maybe I'm assuming too much intelligence
Yeah,
on the part of the
FBI. It wasn't like they weren't getting anything, so they were obviously taking improper steps and dealing with Orr. I mean, Orr is a senior Justice Department official, and he's playing spy games with Christopher Steele. Talk about that.
Right. Well, he's meeting with Steele. He's talking, as you mentioned earlier. Bruce Orr essentially becomes a confidential human source of the FBI after the FBI has terminated Chris Steele in, I think, October 2016, because Christopher Steele was going around blabbing to all the media that he could, Mother Jones and
which the FBI documents confirmed that Fusion GPS was pushing this material out to the media.
Exactly, before the election. So this was an attempt to derail the election. That is, Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele were giving all this bogus information about supposed Russia-Trump collusion to the media before the election, and then that effort falls flat and it fails. And the FBI says, "Oh, well, we can't have our source, Christopher Steele, out talking to the media. That makes him unreliable, so we have to terminate him by FBI regulations." But then they essentially rehire him through their conduit, Bruce Orr.
But talk about the communications, though. Talk about how he was communicating with Bruce Orr, with Christopher Steele.
Well, they were having meetings. They were talking on WhatsApp.
Orr admits he's using this non-governmental application to communicate with a government source about the President of the United States supposedly being a traitor. How is any of that proper?
I don't think it is, and this is actually an issue that
because we don't get WhatsApp.
Right.
FOIA isn't covering. This raises questions. We got to FOIA all the WhatsApp materials that he's referencing,
and that's been a very interesting topic of discussion internally here at Judicial Watch. Michael and I and others have been talking about how do we get these communications. Any written communications that discuss government business are technically federal records under established case law, right? So when you're a government employee, what are the implications of these disappearing apps, where the messages disappear after 1 hour, 6 hours, 12 hours.
Yeah.
But it's a whole nother thing when you're a government employee and you have an obligation to preserve your communications about the business that you're involved in. I mean, it's an area that the FOIA law is going to have to, the courts are going to have to, and the legislature are going to have to address eventually.
So getting back to the Bruce Orr 302s, you've got the FBI interviewing Bruce Orr, who's communicating with Glenn Simpson, sending material from Nellie Orr, giving them material from Fusion GPS during the Trump presidency. So we can't blame this on the Obama Justice Department and State Department. This is an out-of-control FBI, an out-of-control Justice Department. Jeff Sessions and the leadership of the DOJ, presumably, Sessions presumed to step away from the Russia investigation with the biggest mistake of his career. Rod Rosenstein had to have been briefed on this, don't you think?
I think Rod Rosenstein was a deliberate selection by, we
answer my question. Do you think Rod Rosenstein was briefed on the Orr communications with Glenn Simpson and Christopher Steele in the beginning of the Trump administration?
My personal suspicion is that Rosenstein was briefed on everything.
So he would have had to have known. He signed off on one of the FISA warrants that incorporated this dossier.
Exactly. He should be prosecuted, I believe, as for fraud on the court.
So that's a good segue to our next topic of discussion. Why are these reports important as it relates to the FISA fraud?
The Steele dossier, which was the basis for the FISA warrant on Carter Page, which had two-hop authority, which meant the entire Trump campaign was being surveilled by the government effectively.
Right.
We know by James Comey's own testimony that it was salacious and unverified.
But going back to the 302s, what in the 302s demonstrates FISA fraud?
I think there were a number of issues that were raised. One of the things that Bruce Orr emphatically told the government was that his wife, that Christopher Steele was desperate, as you noted earlier, to stop President Trump from being elected.
So they tried to, now they supposedly conveyed the political nature of the background
Yes.
of the dossier to the FISA court, but they didn't use, they were pretending as if it was an open question, weren't they?
Yeah, well, they never informed the court of that it was a political document paid for by the opponent of
Donald Trump.
Hillary
Hillary
Clinton.
Clinton.
So this is a glaring omission, and I would argue a prima facie fraud. It represents a prima facie example of fraud on the court. I don't understand, honestly, how these people cannot be prosecuted and how our country can continue to function as a viable republic. And that sounds hyperbolic, maybe, but there is such a fracture at the foundation of our government and our society right now, and the American people know it.
Well, Rowan Scarborough of the Washington Times did a good story this week. I don't know if you saw it, Bill, highlighting the false information in these FBI 302s targeting Trump that was found either on first read or even under de minimis investigation to be false. I mean, you had, Rick Wilson, who is a Republican critic of President Trump. He's called a Trump campaign advisor at one point, and he's been out there tweeting saying how outraged he is. His name's been dragged into this, but don't blame us. Blame the Steele crowd and the Clinton crowd that was just saying whatever they wanted to say, seeing what stuck.
Right.
But you had these interviews begin in November, continue through just before the appointment of Mueller, and what struck me about them is, and by the way, these FBI 302s that we're talking about are available online at Judicial Watch's website, so you can go and look at the review of the 302 reports yourselves, and do your own digging and see what we're talking about. Is the desperation of the FBI to talk to Steele, which to me suggests nothing was panning out.
The FBI and DOJ had to keep Christopher Steele on board. Okay, he's a foreigner, so he's more difficult to control than an American citizen would be. But so they were desperate to basically keep him on the team and not admit that this was a hocus pocus document, a fraudulent document. His so-called dossier. So it was central to keeping up the keeping up the front that this whole thing was legitimate, is his cooperation. I think that's the reason why they wanted to keep such a hold on him.
So these are the first group of documents of the various documents that Congress and Judicial Watch have called for to be declassified. So this is the first group that's been declassified. But separately, we've been getting other documents about Orr's communications with Nellie Orr and the interactions with the Justice Department about Christopher Steele. And we have another big batch of documents, well over 300 pages that came in. We haven't released them yet, so we're going to be previewing them here. But my gosh, Nellie Orr, for all practical purposes, should have had a desk at the Justice Department.
Yeah, well, she was, as our listener or viewers may not know, CIA was a contract employee of the CIA. She worked for something called...
Who was this?
Nellie Orr.
Nellie Orr had worked for the CIA at one point?
She worked for open source, an entity called Open Source Works, which looks at open source information and does analysis.
And they provide services to the CIA?
Yes, I believe, from what I understand, I've seen it referred to as a CIA entity. I'm not sure if that...
Okay, but she was working for Fusion GPS in 2016.
Right.
And the documents show that she was using Bruce Orr to send all sorts of stuff to the Justice Department about Donald Trump.
Oh yeah. She in fact, she compiled an Excel spreadsheet, which is pretty remarkable to look at. Now, what it purports to show are linkages between Donald Trump and very nasty Russian characters, like an Uzbek or in Russia area characters, an Uzbek mafia don, a former KGB officer suspected in the murder of a guy named Paul Tatum, a Russian who reportedly buys up banks and pumps them dry. This is the wording, the actual wording from the Excel spreadsheet.
And they're all connected to Trump, isn't it?
Yeah, they're all supposedly connected
Why?
to Trump. A Russian money launderer for Sergei Magnitsky, a Turk accused of shipping oil for ISIS. I mean, just ridiculous stuff.
My favorite was she was figuring out who was the guy who may have poured Trump a drink in Russia. You've made an interesting point about, and of course the Clintons are famous for doing this, which is suggesting someone else is doing something they're probably even more guilty of.
Right. Oh, exactly. And this is, you know, what I see this whole cabal essentially being is an effort to strong arm the Trump campaign in order to keep them off of the crimes that Hillary herself was guilty of. We remember Uranium One, right? She got $145 million, the Clinton Foundation did, for 20% of U.S. uranium supplies through the purchase by the Russians of U.S.
But Nellie Ohr isn't sending that material to the Justice Department through her husband.
Well, she was, no, but she.
I mean, my point is, they're not looking at that. I mean, the FBI was focused only on Trump and Russia,
right,
not Clinton and Russia. There's no evidence that we have that Russia and the Clintons were anywhere on the radar of the FBI and Justice Department.
No, absolutely not. But
despite the strong evidence that you're highlighting here.
Right. But what you're suggesting is absolutely true, that they're trying to create this cloud of nebulous Russia, collusion.
It makes the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game seem sophisticated.
Exactly. I mean, I've prepared similar spreadsheets, if you will, looking at drug traffickers and drug money launderers in my government career decades ago. And I know what she's doing here. She's trying to, and I'm not saying I was doing this, I would never create, such really peripheral connections that she was trying to make to try to implicate someone in something. That was absolutely outrageous. But that's exactly what she was doing. She was cherry picking information out of the news, from open sources, trying to draw connections, which you could do.
Conspiracy theory, it sounds like.
Right, which anyone could do with anyone. And if you took the time to go through someone's life, especially a prominent figure like Trump, any prominent figure, you could make some kind of connections, as you suggested, the 6 degrees of separation kind of argument, to connect anyone to any nefarious characters.
Also referenced in the documents, certainly the Bruce Ohr 302s, they talk about Manafort materials being generated by Ohr and given to the Justice Department. Right. And what did we found? We found the reference materials in the documents given to us separately.
Right.
She created a chronology on Paul Manafort.
Yes, and I wonder if that was actually used in the prosecution of Paul Manafort.
I had no idea.
Uh-huh.
Now, I know that Glenn Simpson was interested in Manafort because of his prior reporting in the Wall Street Journal. Mm-hmm. I had no idea that Manafort material from Fusion GPS, I have to say, was sent so specifically through Nellie Ohr to the Justice Department. I had no idea.
I wonder if Paul Manafort was aware of that, if his lawyers were, frankly. I mean, that's a good question. Was Manafort's legal team apprised of these records? I doubt they were.
So we've got this nasty anti-Trump rumor and innuendo being laundered by Bruce Ohr from his wife and the Fusion GPS gang to the FBI. So when you look at the two documents, we've got the 302 saying, yeah, I gave everything that Nellie had to them. And then you look at the documents where we see what it is that he gave to them. It's, talk about an abuse. It's astonishing. And I'm glad Sean Hannity's been covering this. We have some radio shows covering this, and obviously Judicial Watch has been getting the word out. But this is a significant development in understanding the Russiagate conspiracy against President Trump, and the mainstream media, despite this is declassified information that gives a window as to what the Russians, what they thought the Russians were doing with Trump. And isn't it interesting? No one's interested in pursuing this.
I said it earlier. I don't know where America would be. Were it not for these records that we've been uncovering now for years. I mean, going back to the Huma Abedin Hillary Clinton email traffic, that was devastating to Hillary's campaign. The revelations of the pay-for-play corruption at the State Department, the trafficking of top secret information by Hillary on an unsecure personal server. All of that stuff that we've uncovered has been, has been just of invaluable importance, I think, to keeping the American people informed.
Well, Bill, I appreciate the interview. We have more documents coming out. We haven't even reviewed thoroughly yet, but more is coming, which is important to know. This is just the beginning in the unraveling of the deep state conspiracy against President Trump. We appreciate your work in helping us get the word out and analyzing these materials. The way it works is that we ask for the documents, and Bill and his colleagues create the FOIA requests. We don't get the requests fulfilled, and we have to sue in court. And then we get the documents, and we have to analyze them. And Bill, you and Chris Farrell and the other investigators at Judicial Watch are key to making this happen. And I appreciate your support out there that allows us to do this great work. If you're interested in finding out more about Judicial Watch, go to our website at judicialwatch.org. And of course, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and of course here on YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time. Tom Fitton.